Hello, and welcome to our third week on the theme of Christmas for Awakened. This week I want to talk about genealogies. Yes, lists of names. I know it's boring, and if you're anything like me, when you're reading the Bible and you come across a genealogy, maybe you just skip over it and get to something more interesting. But Jesus' genealogies are fascinating. There are two versions, one in the Gospel of Luke and one in the Gospel of Matthew, and they are different. Like, there are literally different names. They also serve various theological functions. Looking at Luke's genealogy, we begin with Jesus, and Luke begins walking us back through Jesus' ancestors, through King David, because the Messiah was supposed to be descended from King David, all the way back to Adam, and then to God. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, we get a higher Christology. That is, Jesus is presented as more divine than he is in the other synoptic Gospels, Mark and Matthew. And so, by tracing Jesus all the way back to God, Luke shows that Jesus is of God and that Jesus' message is from God. Matthew has a different concern. As you remember from last week, Matthew is primarily focused on showing that Jesus is the fulfillment of Hebrew Scriptures, that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. To do that, Matthew begins not with Jesus, but with Jesus' ancestor, Abraham. We begin with Abraham, the father of the ancient Israelites, and then walk down through King David all the way down to Jesus. But there's something else that is incredibly fascinating about Matthew's genealogy, and this is what I want to spend some time with. Matthew includes 5 women in his genealogy of Jesus. Now, this wasn't something that you did in ancient genealogies. You traced the person through their male relatives, not through female. And so it's an intentional choice on the part of the author of the book of Matthew to include women in the genealogy. What's more, each of these women was surrounded by some sort of sexual scandal. Let's take a look. The first to be mentioned is Tamar. Now, if you remember the story of Tamar, Tamar was married and her husband died, but they hadn't had any children. Now, women were a vulnerable class of people in the ancient world, and particularly widows. You may remember the common refrain throughout the Hebrew Bible that we ought to care for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. And widows were especially vulnerable if they didn't have any children who could inherit property. But there were some protections in the ancient world. One of them was something called the levirate obligation or levirate marriage. It was the law that the next living male relative of the late husband was to step in and provide the widow with an heir, hopefully a male heir. That was always the hope in the ancient world. And as you may recall from this story, the relatives weren't particularly interested in doing that, and it came down to Tamar's father-in-law, Judah, who just didn't want to do it. And so Tamar took matters into her own hands. She dressed up like a prostitute, and she tricked Judah into having sex with her to provide her with an heir. Now, this may seem odd to us in the 21st century, but it was a justice issue in that day. Judah was denying Tamar the justice that was owed to her. The next person in the genealogy is Rahab. Now, Rahab was a prostitute who helped the spies who came into the promised land sent by Moses. And she hid them in the walls so that they could stay there and weren't found out. So also surrounded by some sexual scandal, but becomes the hero of the story. The next woman in Matthew's genealogy is Ruth. And you may remember that Ruth had a husband who died as well, and she ended up staying with her mother-in-law, and they travel to her mother-in-law's homeland. And so Ruth is a Moabite, and so she's a Gentile, she's an outsider. And in order to survive, at the behest of her mother-in-law, she seduces an older male relative and ends up marrying him, Boaz. The next woman in the genealogy is listed as the wife of Uriah, or Bathsheba. Now it's interesting that she is not listed by name, but I think it's significant because in Bathsheba's story, David sees her bathing on the roof, and Bathsheba is already married, but that doesn't stop King David. He wants to be with her, and so he sexually assaults her. Again, a woman who is the hero of the story, because in this rare instance for King David, he is not the hero. He is presented as the villain, who then ends up ensuring that Uriah dies so that he can marry Bathsheba. And then the final woman who is listed in Jesus' genealogy is Jesus' mother, Mary, who was an unwed teen mother. And as you may recall, in the Gospel of Matthew, an angel specifically comes to Joseph and asks him not to dismiss Mary because she is pregnant out of wedlock. And so you see, it's interesting that Matthew has chosen to include all of these women who were surrounded by some sort of sexual scandal because Matthew is showing here that Jesus has a special concern for those who are in vulnerable situations. It also shows that God ends up using unlikely people to become the heroes of God's story. I love the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew. It is actually incredibly expansive of my theology. It helps me to think about things a little bit more broadly, and it helps me to recognize that Jesus was, by his very nature, by who he was descended from, Jesus was especially concerned with those who are living on the margins, people in vulnerable situations that he ended up spending his whole life and ministry advocating on behalf of. And that gives me a bit of joy. This week we're going to talk about joy as we light our joy candle as our spiritual practice. Will you join me? This week we focus on joy, and I invite you to turn to your Advent wreath and to find the pink candle of joy. Hopefully your Advent wreath is set up in a place where you can see it daily and remember your journey towards the light. Joy is the pink candle because when Advent was seen as a penitent season, kind of similar to a mini Lent, at this point in the season, they recognized that there was a need for a bit of joy and to ease up on the penitent nature of the season. During those times, they often used purple, and so pink was a lighter version of that to symbolize the joy. I use blue candles because I love the symbolism of hope that comes from the blue candles. This week we light our candle of joy, and as we do so, I invite you to think about what in your life gives you joy. Where are you experiencing joy in your life? Think about those places of joy and give thanks. O great divine presence, help us to realize those places in our lives where we discover joy. May that joy enrich our lives so that we might then spread joy to a weary world. May it be so. Amen.